The last echo of Cold Creek. The lease was cheap, the silence was free, and Elias Thorne needed both. He was a man who used to count trees for a living, a disillusioned forestry surveyor now trying to outrun a city that had grown too loud and a past that had grown too sharp. The cabin, nestled deep in the monolithic shadow of the Pacific crest, was a borrowed solitude. It sat on an old logging claim near a defunct trail called Cold Creek Path. A path now swallowed by moss and high tangle brush, a path few remembered and fewer still dared to walk. The place was perfect. No cell service, a river for water, a wood stove for heat, and 3 locked gates on the dirt track separating him from the nearest paved road. He spent the first week establishing a routine rooted in necessity and vigilance. He split wood until his hands bled, checked the perimeter traps for coyotes, and spent long, slow evenings reading by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The isolation was an antidote. The only sounds were the wind moving through the Douglas firs like a slow, deliberate exhale, and the ceaseless, rhythmic roar of the creek. Then came the silence. It was mid-October, and the temperature had dropped enough for the river to slow its frantic pace. One Tuesday morning, Elias woke to an unsettling stillness. He stepped outside. The wind was gone. The birds were quiet. The massive river, usually a deafening natural white noise, had been muted to a wet, hesitant whisper. It felt less like a quiet morning and more like a breath being held by the entire landscape. He chalked it up to weather inversion and got to work. He was mending a tear in the wire fence near the edge of the property when he saw the tracks. They were in the soft, dark mud near the treeline, 3 distinct, deeply impressed prints. They were bipedal, and huge, easily a size 16 or 17, but the shape was wrong. The heel was too narrow, the arch too high, and the toes were splayed in a disturbing fan pattern, almost like a bird's talon if it had adapted to walk upright. He knelt, pressing a gloved finger into the deepest part of the print. Whatever made it weighed well over 300 pounds. Elias was a rational man. He had dealt with bears, cougars, and wolf packs. These tracks defied classification. They didn't appear to be paws, hooves, or even human boots. And they were long, deliberate strides, not the ambling path of a scavenging animal. They led away from the creek and vanished where the ground hardened into packed pine needles. He spent the rest of the day with his grandfather's old .30-06 rifle resting against the cabin wall, loaded, while he worked. He kept expecting a growl, a snap of a branch, a territorial challenge. Nothing came. Only the low, unnerving hush of the creek. The mimicry started 3 nights later. Elias was drifting toward sleep, the smell of pine smoke heavy in the air, when a sound, impossibly clear, pulled him back. It was a woman's voice, singing. It was faint, almost swallowed by the darkness, but the melody was distinct. A lullaby his mother used to hum, something gentle and profoundly familiar. It came from the dense, unyielding wall of forest behind the cabin, where the land rose sharply into the high country. Elias sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs. There was no other cabin for 5 miles. The nearest town was 30 miles away. No hiker would be off trail in the dead of night singing an obscure German lullaby. He grabbed the flashlight and the rifle. He stood by the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. The light cut a single, useless tunnel into the blackness. The singing stopped. It was instantly replaced by a sound that chilled him to the core, a perfect, clear imitation of his own voice. "Where are you, El? We need the key. I can't find the key." It was his own voice, yet utterly vacant, drained of all inflection and emotion. It sounded like an audio recording played back in an empty metal drum. He hadn't heard that sentence spoken since he was 16, a panicked moment with his younger sister, Jenna, locked out of their house. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. Impossible. He heard it again, this time closer, maybe only 50 yards from the cabin wall. Elias. Elias. The lights are off. Why did you turn the lights off? It was a voice he knew better than his own. It was Jenna's voice. His younger sister, who had died 6 years ago in a traffic accident, a tragic, final silence he had been unable to shake. It was the frantic, tear-choked sound of her voice the moment before the impact, a sound he had spent 6 years trying to forget. He dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. He fumbled for the rifle, his hands slick with cold sweat. This was not a person. A person would call out a name, use a standard distress cry. A person would not use the voice of the dead to try and lure him out. Come out, Elle. I'm scared of the dark. The voice was right outside the thin wooden wall now, a gentle, pleading whimper. Elias stood his ground, sighting the rifle toward the front door, the only way out. He forced himself to breathe, counting the seconds. It wants you to open the door. It knows you want to comfort her. He heard a low, wet snuffling sound on the porch just outside the door, followed by a soft, scraping noise, like long fingernails tracing the rough grain of the wood. He spoke, his voice a ragged whisper. Go away. The scraping stopped. A new voice, deep and resonant, boomed from the darkness, a caricature of a kindly grandfather. Now, son, that's no way to talk to a visitor. Why don't you just open up the door? We'll have a talk. Elias recognized that voice, too. It was the voice of the old man who owned the cabin. The man who had explicitly told Elias, don't, under any circumstances, go outside after sundown. The owner was 80 years old and lived 3 states away. Elias backed away slowly toward the hearth, finding the heavy steel poker. He didn't fire the rifle. Whatever it was, it didn't sound hurt or alarmed. It sounded curious. After 5 minutes of agonizing silence, the thing seemed to lose interest. He heard a final, low, guttural noise, a noise that sounded like a throat being cleared of sludge, and then, only the restored, unnerving hush of the forest. Elias did not sleep. He rebuilt the fire, not for warmth, but for light. By dawn, his face was gray, his eyes ringed with exhaustion and fear. He spent the morning boarding up the windows. He used old pallet wood and thick screws, overlapping the planks until the windows were sealed solid, the cabin interior illuminated only by the light filtering down the chimney and through the gaps in the door frame. He had faced the unexplainable, but he hadn't broken yet. He had seen the tracks and heard the voice. It confirmed a local legend he had dismissed as mountain nonsense, tales of a creature they called the Sylvan Echo, a hunter that lured its prey using their most cherished or most traumatic memories. The next 3 days were a siege. The Echo began its routine exactly at twilight. It was a sophisticated, terrifying game. It used his childhood best friend's voice, reciting their secret handshake rhyme. It followed this with the voice of his college professor, criticizing a paper he'd failed years ago, the words delivered with the smug, cutting malice of a true predator. It wanted to incite either comfort or anger. Either way, it wanted him outside. Next, it used his dead father's voice, a gravelly, authoritative sound, issuing commands. Fix the generator, son. It's cold out here. I can't breathe. Elias, you need to help your old man. The urgency was paralyzing. Elias jammed wads of cloth into his ears, the bass resonance of the mimicry vibrating painfully through the floorboards. Then, it was pure psychological warfare. It didn't speak. Instead, it produced the sound of a latch clicking on the inside of the cabin, right behind him. Then the sound of the rifle action being ejected, then reseated. Elias spun around, poker raised, only to find the rifle undisturbed. The echo could perfectly replicate sounds inside the cabin, playing with his sensory perception of the structure's safety. Elias was running on coffee and pure adrenaline. He had not stepped foot outside. His food was running low, canned beans and jerky. He hadn't dared to pump water from the well. The only thing keeping him tethered to reality was the absolute certainty that the voices were wrong. Too perfect, too vacuum-sealed, and too intimate to be faked by a human. On the 5th day of the siege, he heard a new, terrifying sound in the late afternoon. It was the metallic clang of the first gate on the dirt road, miles away, being opened. The echo wasn't trying to lure him out anymore. It was preparing for company. Elias waited until 11 p.m. before making his move. He knew what was coming. The gate had been secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Only one person had a key and knew the route. Marcus, the supply runner from town who checked on the property every 2 weeks. He was due. The echo had either intercepted Marcus or was using his anticipated arrival to draw Elias out in a frantic rescue attempt. Elias couldn't stay. If he waited, the echo would use Marcus's voice, begging for help, or worse, it would bring Marcus to the cabin, dead or alive, and use the ensuing horror to break his resolve. He put on his heaviest layers, jammed a hunting knife into his belt, strapped the rifle across his back, and gathered the remaining kerosene. He moved to the rear wall, the weakest point of the cabin structure, nearest to the high tangle and the fastest escape route up the mountain. He needed a distraction. He took the can of kerosene and poured it liberally over his reading chair, the wood pile near the stove, and the collection of old newspapers. He struck a match. The fire went up fast, filling the interior with thick, oily smoke. The heat was instantaneous and unbearable. Elias didn't look back. He kicked out the rear window boarding with 2 savage blows, splintering the frame, and scrambled out into the cold, silent air. He immediately heard the response. It wasn't a roar or a cry of surprise. It was a single, piercingly accurate imitation of the cabin's smoke detector, followed by the frantic, wordless screech of a small, frightened child, a sound designed to induce panic and guilt. Elias ignored it, scrambling up the steep incline toward the forest ridge, the heat of the burning cabin a sudden, welcome beacon behind him. He was 50 feet up the ridge when he risked a glance back. The cabin was a column of fire, lighting up the clearing. And then, he saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the orange blaze, watching the fire. It was impossibly tall, easily 9 feet, its proportions stretched and grotesque. Its body was impossibly thin, a skeletal outline covered in skin the color and texture of wet, aged bark. It had no visible hair, and its limbs were spindly, ending in hands that hung below its knees, tipped with those long, splayed talons. But the head was the nightmare. It was small relative to the body, featureless, with no discernible nose or ears, and its eyes were 2 enormous, jet-black orbs that reflected the flames like dark glass. And where a mouth should have been, there was only a wide, horizontal slit that pulsed faintly, like a gill. It was facing away from him, observing the destruction of its hunting grounds, and in that moment, Elias understood why the voices were so perfect. It didn't have a mouth that shaped air. It had a mechanism that vibrated air, perfectly replicating the frequency of any sound it had ever absorbed. Then, the thing turned its head slowly, those black eyes rotating to fix on Elias up the ridge. It raised one of its long, spidery arms, not in attack, but in a strange, deliberate gesture. And it spoke one last time. It used the full, rich, confident voice of Elias Thorne, the man he was before the loss and the disillusionment, the competent, hopeful voice of the surveyor who loved the forest. Elias, you can't leave. This is your home now. The voice echoed across the clearing, and this time, it was laced with a deep, mournful, and terrifying hunger. The chase was silent on the Echo's side. Elias scrambled higher, relying on the cover of the high tangle brush and rocky outcrops. He didn't run down the path toward the main road, that would be too predictable. He ran up, into the thick, treacherous wilderness, using the vertical distance and the noise of the burning cabin to mask his movement. He could hear the creature moving below him. Not walking, but traversing the ground with long, loping, silent strides. A sickening thump swishes its weight settled and its talons dragged. He found a crevice between two enormous granite boulders and wedged himself into the tight space, pulling a screen of rhododendron branches over the opening. He fought the urge to cough, the smoke still acrid in his lungs. The shadow passed overhead moments later. He felt the heavy thud of its landing nearby, and a low-frequency vibration that ran up through the stone. He didn't dare look. Then came the new sound. Not a voice, but a sound he hadn't heard since the first morning, the rush of the Cold Creek River. The echo was making the sound of the river, amplified and distorted, running directly past his crevice. It was trying to convince him he was safe, near water, and that the cabin fire had been a dream. It was a complete acoustic overlay of a safe environment, specifically to counter the terrifying visual of the fire. Elias clapped his hands over his ears, gritting his teeth. The sound was so perfect it hurt his mind. It was trying to override his reality. He stayed curled up for an hour. The sound of the false river faded. When he finally crawled out, the clearing below was dark, the cabin reduced to glowing embers and a column of smoke. The silence had returned, deeper and more malevolent than before. He started walking again, sticking to the highest ridge, moving by the scant moonlight. He walked until dawn, using the rifle stock as a cane, pushing through thickets of thorn and ivy, his clothes torn, his body bruised and bleeding. When the sun finally crested the ridge, painting the cold forest canopy in thin, pale gold, he found a logging road, an old, overgrown access trail miles from the one leading to the cabin. He followed it, staggering, until he reached a paved secondary road. He didn't stop until a county truck, hauling a load of gravel, screeched to a halt beside him. Elias never told the police or the property owner the truth. He told them the truth that fit: a faulty kerosene lamp, a grease fire, a desperate escape through the window. They found the heavy door bolted from the inside, the stove intact, and the fire contained to the cabin footprint. They found the tracks, too, dismissing them as a large, mutated bear. Marcus, the supply runner, was late. He arrived the day after the fire. He was shaken, stating that he'd gone to open the first gate the night before, only to find the chain unlocked but wrapped tightly around the post, cinched with a knot he couldn't undo. He'd driven back, spooked, only to return the next morning and find the chain now locked and untouched. Elias never went back. He settled in a small, cheap apartment far inland, near a highway that offered a comforting, ceaseless white noise. He found a new job, inventorying warehouse supplies, a place where the numbers were finite and the logic was absolute. He started a new routine, but it was flawed. He slept with the lights on. He never used a shower curtain, preferring the open space. And he never, ever allowed silence. He ran the television, the radio, or his own voice, constantly, to fill every crevice of his new apartment. One night, 6 months after Cold Creek, Elias was lying awake. The television was on, tuned to a late-night talk show. The host was mid-sentence, talking about a celebrity scandal. Suddenly, the voice of the host warbled. The cadence broke. Then, from the center of the speaker, not an echo, not a recording, but a live, impossible replacement, came a sound Elias had hoped he would never hear again. It was the clear, desperate voice of his dead sister, Jenna. "Elias, look behind you." Elias sat up, cold dread washing over him. He looked at the television. The screen was dark, the set suddenly unplugged. The voice spoke again, coming from the shadowed corner of his living room, now using the deep, cold, empty tone of his own long-lost confidence. "You left the woods, Elias. But the woods never left the sound." He threw himself out of bed, grabbing the flashlight and a heavy metal thermos. He stood trembling in the middle of the room, shining the light into every corner. Nothing. The apartment was empty. He was still standing there, heart racing, when the sound came again, impossibly close, impossibly intimate. It was a faint, sloshing sound, the sound of water being drawn up a long, narrow pipe. The perfect, wet, rhythmic thump swish of the Sylvan Echo, walking the length of his hallway carpet, patiently waiting for him to believe the silence. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.